In class on Wednesday, we ended here talking about how alligators actually have some pretty complex parental care. But let's move on to look at some of the more interesting and bizarre groups of reptiles. In particular, suborder Sphenodontia. So this is a very primitive squamate. A lot of people call it a living fossil, called the Tuatara. And they're found only in New Zealand. They're about 60 centimeters long, so they're, a little bit over half a meter. But they have a very primitive skull structure that's much more like the very first squamates. They also have this very bizarre pineal eye. So the pineal eye, some people call it a third eye. It just looks like a little dark spot, and it's between the eyes, and it's very thin. Human beings and other mammals have a pineal gland in their brain, and that pineal gland is responsible for producing melatonin, which helps us with our day-night circadian rhythms. So the thought is that since it has the same proteins as our eyes, that it must be sensitive to light intensity. So there is no ability to form an image, but this is thought to grow daily, or it grows out of the roof of the brain, and it's thought to control the daily activity patterns of this interesting character.
Hi, I'm Deborah Searchfield. I'm a keeper here at the Native Fauna section at Auckland Zoo, and today I've got with me Toa, and she's one of our beautiful tuatara. So tuatara are absolutely unique animals. They've been around on Earth for over 225 million years, but their closest relatives died out at the time of the dinosaurs over 60 million years ago. So when scientists first discovered them, they thought, of course, that they were lizards, but it wasn't long before they realised that there's quite important differences between tuatara and lizards, so much so that they've put them as the only species in their order of reptiles. So some of the things that make them different include things like having extra holes in their skulls, their ribs are different, they don't have any external eardrums like lizards do. But I think one of the most interesting differences is that tuatara are born with a third eye. So it's only visible when they're a little wee baby as a hatchling, as a little translucent patch at the top of their forehead here. And once they're a few months old, that the scales grow over the eye and you can't see it anymore. It's quite sophisticated. It's got a lens and a retina, but it's not used for seeing. And they think that it might be, they're not exactly sure what it is used for, but they think that it might be to do with differentiating between light and dark cycles, or maybe for absorbing UV light, because they are nocturnal animals, but they do require UV, so they bask in the daylight. Tuatara is the Maori word meaning spines on the back, and that relates to this crest that they have running down their head and their back. It's larger in the males. This is a girl I've got with me today. And the boys use that in their territorial displays and also in their courtship displays. So if they're trying to attract a girlfriend, or if they're fighting over burrows, they'll make their crest stand up big and tall, stand tall on their legs, puff out their throats, and the biggest, scariest looking tuatara usually wins. They were found originally all over New Zealand, but because we have all of these introduced predators in New Zealand, they in fact have been so successful at hunting them down that now these tuatara are only found on our offshore predator-free islands. Oh, very wriggly today. So these sort of guys are really special. They are sit and wait predators, so when they're looking for food, they'll just sit at the mouth of their burrow, waiting for a food item to come wandering past. So it could be anything like a cricket or a weta or a spider, another lizard, or even a baby tuatara. That would be fine. So they'll just sit and wait, and when something comes fairly close, they'll make a quick dash, lunge at it, and once there's something in their jaws, they don't really get away from them very often. So tuatara are going to be held in the island precinct in the new Te Wānui area of the zoo, and that'll be a good recreation of the coastal areas that they live in. It's a fantastic enclosure that with a new roof that opens and closes, so we're able to give them extra UV light when they require it, and then we're able to close it down if it's too much rain or just too much sun for them. So it's a great enclosure, and there'll be several tuatara in there, so people will always should have a good chance to view them, whatever they're doing during the day.
The video already told us a little bit about their natural history, so we did learn that they are carnivores and insectivores. They are nocturnal. So they are active with a body temperature as low as 8 to 11 Celsius. The interesting thing is that they could live 60 to 70 years in captivity. That's a really old lizard. My blue-tongued skink, he's 20 years old. Actually, maybe he's 23 now. They're only supposed to live until they're 20. And that's considered to be fairly long-lived, but this guy takes the cake. They do produce an amniotic egg, but get this, it's a 1-year incubation period. So that's a very, very long time to be forming a reptile. So most reptiles have a shorter 45 to 90 day gestation or incubation period. They do undergo internal fertilization, so there's no intromittent organ for the direct deposit of sperm inside of the female's vent. Instead, they use what's called a cloacal kiss, where their cloaca or vents come into contact with one another, and the male can release his sperm in direct contact that way. Now, these guys are a very strange group of reptiles, and these are suborder Amphisbaenia, the worm lizards, and they are about 165 species, and they're found in tropical and subtropical regions of South America and Africa. I have personally never seen one, and it's one of those things I've always wanted to see. They are fossorial, meaning that they burrow in the soil, and they, if you recognize the body plan, they're very similar to apodans, so the caecilians that we saw when we talked about amphibians. So convergent evolution has, through the exposure of the organisms to similar environmental conditions, created a similar form. They have no paired appendages because those would get in the way as they tried to burrow through soil. And their eyes and their ears are hidden beneath their skin, so they're considered to be vestigial. They still can detect light and some shapes, but not as complex as eyes that you would find in other reptiles. And that would make sense because they live in an underground environment. They have a very short tail, and they do retain some vestigial limb girdles, so you can see a little bit left of the pelvic and pectoral girdles. And they have a skull that is very blunt, and it acts as a ram to help it burrow through the soil. And they also have pincher-like teeth that are unique to that particular group. And there's only one tooth in the midline of the upper jaw, and all of them are oviparous, laying eggs.
Standard. The worm lizards of South America, with their odd appearance, can rouse the curiosity of even the most stoic of nature enthusiasts. The Amphibian and Reptile Diversity Research Center at the University of Texas at Arlington is a premier facility for investigating herpetological curiosities and understanding the biology of some of the world's most fascinating creatures. With more than 120,000 specimens from over 90 countries, the collection is the largest of its type in Texas. The facility is frequently used by students, faculty, and visiting herpetologists from around the world.
Aquí tenemos un ejemplar de Amphisbaena alba o morrona o culebra de dos cabezas, como comúnmente se le llama en Venezuela. Esta es una especie de reptil ápodo, no posee miembros y no es una verdadera serpiente, ¿no? Aunque comúnmente se le llama culebra de dos cabezas, ¿no? Por poseer los dos extremos, tanto la cabeza como la cola, muy parecidos. Se alimenta principalmente de lombrices, aunque posiblemente podría alimentarse también de bachacos o hormigas. Esta especie tiene unos músculos bastante fuertes en la mandíbula, pero es una especie que no es peligrosa para el hombre, ¿no? Generalmente se tiene la creencia que si se introduce un ejemplar en una botella de aguardiente, luego ese líquido puede ser utilizado para curar ciertas enfermedades como dolores de los músculos y otras enfermedades parecidas. Es una especie de amplia distribución en Sudamérica y generalmente son de un color uniforme. Existen otras especies como patrón de coloración distintos, ¿no?
Worm lizards are perfectly suited for a subterranean life. Solidly constructed skulls, muscular bodies, and reduced eyes are all necessary components for an underground existence. To the casual observer, this view of the Venezuelan llanos provides no hint to the fascinating reptiles living just beneath the surface. Currently, there are 165 recognized species of worm lizards, some of which are only known from a single solitary specimen. How many species are there? Will new species be discovered? How long do they live? These are just a few questions scientists would like to answer. Until then, we remain amazed at these fascinating denizens of a dark underworld.
Now that we've looked at the bizarre, let's take a step back and look at the familiar. So suborder Lacertilia, or lizards, these are very familiar to us because we see them everywhere. And that makes sense since there's about 3,000 species worldwide. So the majority of lizards are terrestrial, but some of them burrow, some of them live aquatic lifestyles, and some of them climb trees and even glide or appear to fly. They're pretty old, so they come from the Triassic period. And 80% of the lizard species weigh less than 20 grams. So it's about the size of a fence lizard, those spiny little lizards that you see running around everywhere. But the very largest species is the Komodo dragon, and we did get a chance to see the Komodo dragon in our David Attenborough video. So they can be up to 3 meters long and weigh 170 pounds. So they weigh a little bit more, but not that much. And we find them in small islands in Indonesia, and these things are so aggressive they will attack pigs, humans, and water buffalo, but their mouth is so nasty that they can wait for their prey. All they have to do is bite them and wait for them to die. So they have a flexible joint in their skull, which gives them a wider gait, and we call that skull kinesis. They do have movable eyelids, so if you see a lizard looking at you, even if that lizard doesn't have limbs and looks like a snake, if it winks at you, you know it's a lizard. And they have a fusion of the lower jaw rami, so the dentary bones are fused together. They also have an external auditory meatus, so they do have an opening into their ear, so it is an external opening. A little bit more about them. They have this really interesting adaptation that when confronted with a predator or when caught by a predator, they can drop their tail off and then they can regenerate it. So many of you may have played with lizards as little kids, and you may have experienced this, or maybe you loved them a little too hard when you picked them up and then their tails would come loose. I know that I am responsible for the autotomy of a number of lizards throughout the years. But this is a really interesting phenomenon, and they do have these weakened muscle sites in their caudal vertebrae, and when they drop their tail, they can just shut off their circulatory system so that they don't bleed, and their tail can, in some cases, be almost rocketed off of the body of the lizard. And the interesting thing about it is that the tail will wiggle when the lizard sheds it, and the predator will cue in on the tail and allow that lizard to escape unscathed. So I did find a video of someone taunting a lizard, and eventually it does lose its tail. So please don't do this. It's not very nice. The lizard can grow it back, but the tail's never really exactly the same as it was. So in this video, there's a guy taunting a legless lizard with a shoe. And as you can see, he taunted it enough that the lizard was actually able to just release its tail. It just kind of clamped it off itself, and the tail wiggles and keeps the predator interested in the tail and allows the lizard to escape. So lizards are able to regenerate their tails, but the tails are not always as complete as they were, and they can only fracture at one point once. So, you know, if they lose their tail, a lot of times they can't really completely regenerate it. A little bit more about them. Most of them are insectivorous, so they consume insects, but there are carnivores and there are even herbivorous lizards. So many of you may be familiar with green iguanas that eat primarily herbaceous diet. They do have interesting courtship behaviors, so they do have mating and territorial displays, and one of which is actually quite famous, the American anole. So you can see that anole showing the female his dewlap, which he can unfold from his neck, and it's colored, and he does some push-ups, and a lot of lizards do push-up displays. So he's showing the female how pretty he is. And often males will display each other in an aggressive way, both showing each other their their red flaps. So these are being studied right now by Dr. Mary. So if you're interested in learning more about why lizards do this, he would be an interesting person to talk about this with. These behavioral and mating territorial displays often involve skin patches with color. So you will often see male lizards that have very beautiful scales or ornamentations that tell other male lizards that this is my territory and attract females. So they do a lot of push-ups, and we saw some of those push-ups in the anole video, but I did find kind of a funny video of another lizard doing push-ups, and the guy who's filming it really does not understand what's going on. This video is a little unusual because this lizard is defending its territory from a mammal. So kind of weird to see a lizard displaying to a mammal. Another interesting thing about the lizards is that they have a paired hemipenis. So the interesting thing about a hemipenis is that it's not a half penis like the herpetologists suggest it would be using the Latin term for half. They are two independently functional penises. So if something were to happen to one, they have a backup. And they develop within amniotic eggs, but these amniotic eggs are leathery. But there are some geckos that have a little bit of a stronger calcium carbonate covering. But lizards run the whole gambit of developmental types. So they can be oviparous, ovoviviparous, and viviparous. And they come out of the egg looking just like a miniature adult. So there's usually no parental care. Now this one is either your most favorite or least favorite group, depending on if you're scared of them or not, and this is suborder Serpentes. So you may see this referred to as suborder Ophidia, so this is a little bit of an older term. There's about 2,700 species, and they're found in the tropics and the temperate areas of the world, and snakes can be found in just about every habitat, the terrestrial, on the ground, arboreal, in the tree, fossorial, underground, And there are even marine snakes that, in fact, some of them are some of the most venomous snakes in the world. Snakes are as old as the Cretaceous, and they can be anywhere from as small as 20 centimeters to over 10 meters in length, which is very long. And they are legless, so there are some more primitive species like boas that have vestigial limbs and girdles, and they actually have a claw that the male can use to stimulate the female. Alright, so what we're looking at right now is the spur. You can see it a little bit closer. It looks like a little claw on that boa's tail, basically. And that male is using that spur to stimulate the female for mating. Now, the number of vertebrae that snakes have can vary from 160 to 400, and this would allow them to have additional articulation points and allow them to be remarkably agile for something that doesn't have any arms and legs at all. They don't have a tympanic membrane, so if you were looking for an ear, you're not going to see one. They don't have an eyelid, and they have a strange way of moving their eye, so they can't really move their eye around, but they can focus in and out. But the most interesting thing about snakes is their highly modified kinetic skull. So their skull can flex in such a way to allow them to eat very large items. So kind of the rule of thumb is that a snake can eat anything that's as large as the largest diameter of its body. So the skull is very mobile. It has up to 8 moving parts. And this is because the dentary bones are not completely fused. So they have a flexible tissue holding that together. So this snake has found an egg, which looks like it would be a very difficult meal to swallow. Notice how that lower jaw, those flexible tissues are allowing that dentary bone to stretch out from the other side of its lower jaw. And it has some very flexible skin. And as you can see, it's walking its mouth side by side across that egg to push it through. And scientists call this the pterygoid walk because they're actually walking the pterygoid bone back and forth to move whatever their meal is down into their body. And then digestive acids are going to eat through that eggshell, or many snakes are actually able to crack that egg once it gets into their body. So this is one of those many times that I'm glad that I'm not a snake, because I think that that would be a really uncomfortable way to eat. But they're able to make a living and eat a meal maybe once or twice a month, depending on what kind of snake it is. If you have a pet snake, they're probably going to get fed a lot more. But snakes can go a very long time without food. Here's the poor guy trying to push that egg down further into its digestive tract. And there he is trying to crack the egg. A little bit more about snakes, because they are very interesting. They do have a single long lung, and this lung extends quite a bit of their body length. And they do have a glottis. So a glottis is a little tube that is going to lead into the trachea of a snake. And because they don't have a hard palate, in order to breathe while they eat, because obviously swallowing meals of a very large size is going to be difficult and it's going to block a lot of their mouth, they can stick this glottis out of their mouth to allow them to eat and breathe at the same time. They don't have a tympanic or eye movement, or tympanum and eye movement, but they can see very well, and they can actually hear fairly well. I mean, they can feel our vibrations, and they know that when they know sound is there, they can detect it. So they detect those airborne vibrations. But they can't really hear all frequencies. It's fairly narrow. And I mentioned that they have a very strange way of changing their eye focus. So this is called accommodation. So us and a lot of other vertebrates, we change the shape of the lens. So we have muscles in our eyes that can relax and allow that lens to become round, so when we need to focus up close. But then we make the lens more oval in order to focus farther away from the snake, or farther away from the object that we're looking at. So this accommodation is interesting because the only thing a snake can do is just move its lens back and forth, so they cannot change the shape of the lens. They also have a Jacobson's organ, and many of you have probably been taught growing up that snakes smell with their tongues, and that's why they stick their tongues out. And these are paired pits at the roof of the mouth, so you're probably wondering why snakes have forked tongues. It's because of these paired pits. So the particles are then transferred to these paired pits with the fork and the tongue, and this allows them to detect smells in the environment. So this is important for them to sense whether or not a female is receptive for mating, and it can allow them to recognize prey. And incidentally, if you handle a snake after handling rodents, you can expect that that snake will probably bite you because they will smell rodent on you. And I've personally been bitten a lot by snakes just because I was working with rodents and then went to work in the vivarium. So this idea of how snakes lost their legs, there's some anatomical indications of this fossorial stage in evolution. So we feel that snakes lost their legs so that they could burrow. So they descended from a group of fossorial or burrowing lizards. The interesting thing about snakes is that their functional eye re-evolved from a vestigial one, because we often see, like we just saw in the worm lizards, that burrowing animals often lose a functional eye. But snakes, they were able to re-evolve a functional eye, and that could probably explain why their eyes function a lot differently than other eyes that we find in vertebrates. They do not have an eyelid or eye movement, so it's really difficult to tell when a snake is actually looking at you. It's also difficult to tell when they're asleep. And the development of these eyes, the way they develop embryologically, is different than in other vertebrates as well. They also have unique cones. So cones would be detecting color, and they have no retinal oil drops, which is something that we would find in other vertebrates. They have a specialized scale that covers the eye called a spectacle, and when they shed their skins, they actually have to shed the spectacle. And I've spent many hours soaking snakes and trying to get stuck spectacles off of the eye. So if you don't shed the snakes properly, that stuck spectacle can actually lead to blindness. So as far as their feeding, you're not going to find a snake that's a vegetarian. All of them are carnivores. And the rattlesnakes and other pit vipers, they have these very interesting sensing organs that sense heat, so they sense infrared signatures. And they use a form of hunting known as constriction, where they basically suffocate their prey, or they asphyxiate them, and then they eat them whole. At least the non-venomous snakes use this constriction in order to eat their food. But the venomous snakes have modified teeth that form fangs. And these fangs are actually hinged in rattlesnakes, so when rattlesnakes bite, they can extend those fangs forward. And I have a couple of neat videos that show you how snakes are seeing the world and what it looks like in slow motion when they strike.
All warm objects constantly emit heat in the form of infrared radiation. The camera senses this infrared in amazing detail. It means Michael can record the snake's movement in total darkness.
This camera is really useful for us here tonight because it allows us to see basically what the snake is seeing. We are looking through a snake's eyes when we use this infrared sensitive camera.
The goal of this experiment is to see whether the snake can sense a warm object in the pitch black. The target is a black balloon filled with warm water. To the snake, it should look like a warm-blooded mouse or a small rat.
We'll have that balloon swinging back and forth like a pendulum. The balloon is black, the background is black. We'll actually turn the lights out for you here. So there's no visual contrast. The idea is that there should be no way to see that balloon. The only difference between the balloon and the background should be thermal contrast. The balloon is warm, the background is relatively cool.
Handling a large python in the day requires great care. It's even more difficult in the dark. Michael covers the snake with a box until he's ready to start the experiment.
These snakes have lots of teeth, so if they bite you, you know it.
But for Michael, it's worth the risk. If the experiment works, the footage will be a world first.
So after the lights are off, we'll remove the box from the snake. The snake will be free, and hopefully we'll see some very interesting behavior. We'll learn something new about this amazing, unusual sensory system.
In the pitch black of the swamp at night, conventional vision is useless.
It's really dark. I can barely see to get this box off the snake. I'm afraid it might look like a warm balloon to this snake. Uncover the snake. It's a good thing we have this infrared camera. Otherwise, I'd have no idea where the snake is.
The sensitive infrared camera picks up the faint heat of the snake as a vivid orange, and the warm balloon as a bright white.
Here he comes. Tongue flicking at it, moving his head with it. He definitely sees it. He definitely sees it. He's got eyes, but it is pitch black dark out here. So something else is telling him that that balloon is there. It is absolutely dark. It cannot be using its eyes, but it's following the motion of that balloon. It knows that balloon is there.
So we just watched how snakes are capable of using their heat-sensing pits, and many of the vipers, like rattlesnakes, are able to detect their prey that way. So this video is someone who's kind of being stupid. They're causing a snake to bite, and they're having it basically bite their GoPro camera. So they've slowed it down so that we can actually see what it looks like when a snake bites. So please do not try this at home. You should be able to see those fangs hinge forward. This guy taunts the rattlesnake for quite some time, and rattlesnakes are actually quite passive organisms, and they just want to be left alone. So if you do encounter one, stay still and listen for that rattling, because that rattling is telling you that he doesn't want you messing with him. As far as venoms go, most snakes are not venomous. This is the primitive condition. Venom evolved as a mechanism to subdue prey, and they came from digestive enzymes, which we can also call proteolytic enzymes, and these are enzymes that split the peptide bonds between amino acids and proteins. So they're literally breaking down proteins. And there's a couple different types. There's hemorrhagens or hemotoxins, and then there's also neurotoxins. So rattlesnakes in general produce hemotoxin, and they basically digest your body from the inside out. So rattlesnake bites that have been left untreated and haven't killed someone, often they will have permanent scarring and maybe even disability from some of these bites. So it really breaks down the tissue. It's not a nice thing to look at. It's very painful, and it can cause you to hemorrhage, so you can bleed uncontrollably, and again, it can cause permanent tissue damage. Now, neurotoxins, these are the really scary ones. These are the nerve poisons, and there was a woman who worked in the vivarium before I got there at Cal State Pomona, who eventually ended up working with cobras at the Los Angeles Zoo. And she eventually got bit by a cobra, and she died so quickly that she didn't even get to the phone. So these are not good things to mess with, and I was never allowed to work with the cobras. I only worked with the rattlesnakes and puff adders and death adders and things like that. Gaboon vipers, the smaller, more mellow snakes. The thing about neurotoxins is that there's usually no pain because they are inhibiting your body's ability to sense pain, and it's going to interfere with your nervous system. And usually you die because you stop breathing, because your smooth muscle is not getting the signals it needs to contract. A little bit more about their natural history. They do have internal fertilization. They also have hemipenises, just like the lizards, and they use an amniotic egg. They also run the gambit of oviparous, viviparous, and ovoviviparous methods of incubation. The interesting thing about snakes is if you want to determine if a snake is female or male, you can use a sexing probe. If it's a male snake, that male is going to have chambers in its cloaca here. And those chambers are going to be where the hemipenes reside when they're not being used. The female does not have chambers because she doesn't have a hemipene. So if you were to stick a sexing probe into her vent, it would not go in very far. And here we can see an image of hemipenes and a cute little boa hatching from an egg. So those are the major groups of reptiles that I want you to know. And when we come back from spring break, you will give your discussion of the reptiles that you found for the reptiles of Pennsylvania. I will also be posting questions to go along with the natural history of reptiles, but because we are leaving to go to Florida in less than 3 hours, I will be posting those from Florida, and I will likely also do a recorded lecture of the amniotic egg. So stay tuned for that. And if I don't talk to you, have a wonderful holiday. Make sure that you're safe, and I sure hope you don't get the St. Francis GI bug.